Okay.
Materials that are chosen have to be very durable. They have to be easily cleaned because they're high traffic areas, and um, so it's a very utilitarian decision based on the use. In some buildings, elevators also, in addition to carrying passengers, are sometimes asked to carry other things. So they need to be durable in that sense. The one thing to keep in mind about the design of the elevator car is the way elevators function, and you may know this, is there's a platform that has the guideposts, and that's actually what moves up and down. The car slides and fits on top. Yeah. So the car can be anything. It can be utilitarian, or it can be, a beautifully designed tiny little room. Yeah. And part of that material choice comes down to cost, economics. Yeah. It's much more expensive to have an elevator car that's made out of beautiful wood and glass and mirrors and all this kind of thing. It's very easy to use stamped metal panels, and they're much more economical. Yeah. So a lot of the time it's a decision with the client, in that they're not going to spend a lot of money on the inside of the elevator. I think there are many architects who, in fact, don't think about what could be a very exciting part of the design. Yeah. There's a standard way to do it, which does work. I mean, you have to place them so that people can easily get access to them, so that they serve the floor plan of the building efficiently. There is some science to that in terms of the number of elevators, where they're placed. But I think many designers forget that this is another design opportunity, that they could make it more of an experience, but that costs money. Yeah. And that's why some designers, if they're going to try to convince a client to spend more money, they might make a different kind of decision and say, well, we'd rather have you spend money over here than have an elevator that has an observation window in it, or something. But I do think there are architects, they just don't see that it is a design opportunity. Well, I call it a room because historically, that's how it has been considered, and I think that is why it is, from a cultural perspective, one of the most awkward spaces in a building, because we know how to behave in a room. If it's someone's apartment living room, we know how we're supposed to behave in the social construct of that. If it's a classroom, if it's an office, here is this tiny little space that really looks like a room in many ways. It has a door, a specific kind of door, and but yet we don't know how. We know how we're supposed to act, but it's a very prescribed behavior. And the best one example of that, and this is maybe an odd example. I was recently in London, and the subway station at Covent Garden is 80 feet below ground. So you take an elevator to go up. It holds about 50 people. So there were 50 people standing in the hallway waiting for the elevator, and the hallway was about the same size as the elevator. In the hallway, lots of conversation, lots of noise. The elevator doors open, 50 people go in, conversation stops. Everybody rides up, the doors open, and then they begin talking again. It's a very funny thing. Yeah. But I think part of it is, certainly in Western culture, one, we don't like being that close to each other. You can watch people in elevators, certainly in Western culture, someone will stand in the center if they're by themselves. If someone else moves in, they'll sort of move to a corner, or they'll, and you can watch people position themselves. And which is why very rarely do you see elevators filled to capacity, unless they're in certain settings. The elevator may hold 15 people. On average, only 10 will get on board, because again, we don't like to be that close to each other. Yeah. Now, in other cultures, Hong Kong might be a good example. Yeah. I don't know this. The elevators probably are much more tightly packed, because the cultural sense of personal space is very different. Yeah. it's such a small space, especially for Westerners. We sort of pull into ourselves, but also I think it's a small thing, but most of the time you walk in and then you rotate 180 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
That act of rotation, I think, is actually very interesting.
Yeah.
Because you can watch people do that, ride up, and when they step out, they pause. They don't know where to go because they're slightly disoriented, even though all they've done is turn around. At least with me, especially in some buildings where when you exit, and this is another design issue, if you exit and there are no visual clues, think of hotels you may have been in, where it looks the same right and left.
Yeah.
How many times it takes you to remember my room is to the left?
Yeah.
Because you spin around and you step out and you're looking for a clue. Where's the number thing that says, okay, that's right, these number rooms are this way or this way. So there's a movement to it as well. I don't know.
Okay.
I think that might depend on the person. I mean, it is one. Some of us enjoy having the elevator all to ourselves. I think the bigger social question is, if let's say I'm on the elevator and then the doors open and you step in. Well, do I just step aside and not say anything to you? Do I say, oh, what floor would you like? And I offer to push the button for you. Now you may think well, I can push my own button. Why is this person interfering? Why are they talking to me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's more, I think, that issue that it's just, especially if it's someone you don't know. But it does depend on the setting. If it's an apartment building, you may recognize the person, or you may assume, well, they live in the building, and you might be more likely to speak with them than if it was an office building, or if it's an academic building.
Yeah.
If it's a student, but in an academic building, it gets more challenging if it's a student and the doors open and your professor steps through, or the dean, or someone who you know is an important person in your institute. Then it's very awkward because you're trapped in this tiny little space with this very important person. And as a student, you don't know, do you say good morning? Do you say nothing? Do you wait on them? And that also varies from culture to culture.
Mm. Yeah.
I do think it is. It's so small, and it's unless it has an observation window or something, it's completely enclosed, and that's also part of it. I mean, you can be in a smaller space, but if it has an open character or quality, I think that would help. But I also that's the culture that has developed about that form of transportation. We don't act that way on subway trains, and we can be just as crowded, but we'll continue talking to our friend while we're hanging on and riding the subway or a bus. But they're slightly bigger. They have windows. I really think it comes down to it. In most instances, it's very small. There are very few exceptions to that. There's a museum I've been in that was designed by Zaha Hadid in the United States, where the only elevator in the museum is the elevator that they use to carry artwork between the floors. So it's probably 12 feet by 12 feet by 12 feet. It's this vast. So these huge doors open, and it's wonderful because you step into this great big room that goes up, and it really feels like a room. Now, there are some settings where you could probably come up with a reason to say, well, rather than having a big freight elevator and a passenger elevator, we can combine them. And I'm sure that's why she did it, because it made that just this slightly off-kilter experience.
That's interesting.
Well, part of it depends on where the mirror is, because if the mirror's on the back of the car, what do? We all turn around and face the front, so we don't see the mirror.
Yeah.
If the mirror's on the front panels, then yes, I've often wondered about if you put a mirror in the back, why? Because no one looks that way. I mean, if you want to make people feel uncomfortable, go in the elevator and stand with your back to the door while it goes up and see what people do. I mean, it's again, I think a lot of it comes down to just the size. But yeah, I mean, elevators many of them used to have mirrors and sort of beautiful interiors, but it's just this, it's the only room in the building that moves. And
Yeah.
I think that if we actually recognize that it is a space that people occupy, then we might begin to think about it differently as designers in terms of, its finishes. And of course, one thing that many architects, and many know, but they sort of forget they know these things. You may have been in an elevator that the doors open in front, and when you enter in, you also see another set of doors on the other side. And when they go up, the other set of doors may open, and you exit through what you think of as the back of the elevator. That gives you a lot of design flexibility, because then suddenly you've got two fronts on the elevator. Now that also can be very confusing, because, well, which doors do I look at? I don't know what door is going to open. So it's a challenge for riders. But there are things that designers could do that would allow them to place the elevators more flexibly. I can have two sets of doors. Elevators don't have to be square in plan. They can be rectangular in plan. The size can depend on what I'm carrying in the building. And I think one of the challenges, and there may be some buildings that you've seen, there's a new way to access elevators. One of the phrases is called destination dispatch. And how that process works, many new buildings employ a version of this. When you enter the lobby, there are no up and down buttons. There'll be a small kiosk with a touchpad, and you key in the number of the floor you're going to. Let's say I walk in, I key in 15, and then the pad flashes often a letter designation. It might flash B, and then I go stand in front of elevator marked B. The doors open, I walk in, I don't push any button inside the elevator automatically takes me to my floor. So suddenly I have no control. I push no buttons except outside. But it's a much more efficient way of dispatching elevator traffic, but suddenly the interface changes. I no longer walk up to the elevator bank, I walk up to this object in the lobby that then determines where I go. Another factor that I'm sure you've seen in many, many office buildings is, well, one, I don't get to the elevators until I pass the security guard, and they verify I'm supposed to be there. And then in many instances, I cannot even get to the elevator banks without swiping an ID or something, and then these little gates raise up, for security. That's also changing how we interact with this technology. And again, I don't think architects, they're following the guidelines of the security specialists. I don't think architects have really recognized there has to be a better way to do that, a better design solution than all of these barriers to get into buildings.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, on the one hand, the two doors are there for it's simple security.
Yeah.
The doors are designed such that the doors on the elevator car cannot open until the car is stopped and locked in place. The doors to the elevator shaft cannot open until there's a car there and locked in place. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned the thickness of the doors. There is a company, I believe in Germany, that is now marketing very, very, very thin elevator doors. And the reason is that's allowing them to increase the size of the elevator car to get greater capacity. And I think as new materials are developed, we'll see that, especially in retrofitting older buildings with elevators. So it's part of what you're seeing now is that has been the industry standard for a long time, and like, you know, it's why, I don't know, you know, automobile tires are designed the way they are. That's just what we've done.
Yeah.
And now, some companies are starting to look at, well, if we're placing new elevators in an older building, how can we get more efficiency? Part of that is the need for larger cars. So if we have thinner doors, I could have a slightly larger cab. And even if I only gain a couple of square feet, that can be very important. So I think you'll see, but again, and I'm delighted you mentioned doors. That is something from a design point of view. They don't have to be solid. They can be glass.
Yeah.
And you've seen installations with beautiful. Now there's a maintenance issue. They have to be cleaned and all of that. But if you have the money, you can do anything you want. The entire car can be glass. And you've seen that probably in some observation. And you know, it's just a matter. There's no limit to what can be done. It's just if you have the budget in the building.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that you find is, and a lot of these, I would encourage you, think of your own experience, is part of it depends on the number of elevator doors you're looking at. You know, if you're in, typically you won't find more than 4 elevators in a row. But if you have 4 of them in a row, and if it's a building where you press the button, I want to go up, so I push the button, then you sort of quickly step back and you look from door. You're trying to figure out which is going to open.
Yeah.
And some of them have very clear indicators above, and you know, okay, that elevator's moving. Or they may have floor indicators, so you know, I'm on the 15th floor. Well, that one's on the ground floor. That one's on 25. Oh, that one's on 13 and coming my direction. That, you know, so a lot of how people interact with is what information you're going to give them in terms of what am I supposed to be looking at. There's nothing more confusing than pushing the button and having no idea, except you just keep looking back and forth and wait and hope that it makes a sound.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it goes ding or rings a bell.
Yeah.
Sometimes the door's just open. And if you're distracted, you wandered over to look out the window, you suddenly turn around and all you see is the door closed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It makes me.
It's and some of that too, I think, depends on the building in that some elevator doors seem to be recessed very far into a wall, so there's a very definite opening. Some are much closer to the surface. I think that's like any door. Some things are more inviting.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's sort of pushed back in and in shadow, it's, you know, that may not be as inviting as something that, you know, because and part of that simply depends on the construction of the wall.
Yeah. Okay.
Again, part of that I think is personal, but there is no question that in most applications, particularly office buildings, one of the most important aspects of elevator design is having enough elevators for the building population and that they operate at a sufficient speed, particularly early in the morning, perhaps at lunchtime, but certainly at the end of the day, to, within a very short window of time, get everybody up to their office and work, and then back home and back downstairs. Because one of the things that, and this is pretty much a global industry standard, from the time that someone pushes the button to call for the elevator until the doors open, I think the time limit is now about 25 seconds. If more than 25 seconds go by, we don't like it. That's when you start pushing the button again, which does nothing. It will not hurry the elevator up.
Yeah.
It may make her feel better, but it will not help. But that actually says something about who we are as a people when we can't wait half a minute before we lose patience because we want to go now. Now that's an office building. Other settings, an apartment building, we're a little more patient. In a hotel, we may be a little more patient. In a classroom building, we know the elevators never work. That's not true. Well, in a lot of American universities, the slowest elevators, in America,
Same here.
a lot of universities.
Yeah.
They never seem to go very fast.
No.
So, but as far as the speed getting on, part of it is perhaps, well, if I get on and there's no one else, I can push the button and I will go there very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, one of the things to remember in most settings, even though you may be by yourself on the elevator, you're not alone because you're being watched. Because there's a camera.
Yeah.
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 Sometimes you can see the camera. If I can see the camera, I always wave. I don't know if that's a good idea, but I
Yeah.
always do. But you are being watched.
Yeah.
Not in every setting, but increasingly for obvious reasons, for security.
Yeah.
Well, another social aspect of elevators that is declining because of the presence of cameras is, of course, they for couples, they used to provide an interesting opportunity because the doors close and no one can see you, and now there's a certain sense of adventure as you ride along. And that's always been an interesting part of their history. Well, one part of contemporary culture, and you may have heard that it's a very specific phrase. It's called the elevator pitch or the elevator talk. It's a very specific business phrase, and what that refers to is, let's say that the three of us worked in the same company, and the three of you had a new idea, and you wanted to make sure that I heard about it, and you saw me standing near the elevators. You would jump in the elevator with me and use that 60-second elevator ride to try to sell me your idea, because I can't get away. You have, I am a captive audience, and they're in business. They're developed a whole strategy about how to use that time most effectively. If you get an opportunity with someone to in 60 seconds say, here's my idea, I want to get this in front of you, and because they can't say, I don't have time to talk to you. Well, they can, but they can't go anywhere. So they sort of hang, I would have to listen to your idea. So that's one sort of new kind of behavior, because it is an opportunity, and in some settings you actually do take advantage of the elevator to continue a conversation. I did that this morning. I attended a meeting across campus. A group of us in the meeting all rode down in the elevator together. In that instance, we continued the meeting, talking informally, but about the meeting subject in the elevator and then out the building, so that we could use our time efficiently.
Yeah.
Now, where that gets awkward is if three of you want to talk to me and someone else comes on the elevator. Now it's slightly awkward, because you might not want them to hear what you're saying, or you might feel, if you've ever been on an elevator too where someone has answered a cell phone, it's very strange.
Yeah.
Because we are, told that, it's impolite to listen to other people's conversations. Well, there's not much you can do when they're standing next to you talking on their cell phone.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Like in opposite.
I think that's a very good observation. It is that, and that may be part of it, is it's you're not in that room very long, so there's no point in engaging someone in a conversation. That could, yes, I think that is true. The one thing that they have tried in elevators with modest success is sometimes you'll see small monitors that might have news broadcasts or stock market information or something like that. One product that is currently being developed that is, I do not think it's been marketed yet, is the idea is when the elevator doors open, when you look to the back of the car, there would be 3 large television monitors from floor to ceiling. Those monitors would be linked to cameras located on the outside of the building so that as the elevator car rose, you would be seeing what was outside. So making an observation elevator out of an elevator that's in the interior of the building. And the idea is to make the experience more interesting.
Yeah.
Now, that's been developed. I don't think it has been employed in any buildings yet. But it's one idea to change the experience. I have no idea if it will work or be effective. Yeah, and that is fairly common, because then you're right. You can show very quick advertisements.
Yeah.
And I don't know their effectiveness, but it does make the ride a little more interesting.
Yeah.
One description that I've heard, and I think this is true, is if we imagine the sort of elevator as a square. So if one person enters in, they typically will stand in the center.
Yeah.
If the second person enters, they'll go to the diagonal corners, somehow. And for each person who comes in, they'll move to the empty corner. So if there are 5 people, you have one in the center and one in each corner, or something like that. Because we're trying to get as far away from each other as we possibly can.
Yeah.
And then as other people enter, then that pattern breaks down, but still we're trying to maintain some personal distance between each other. So that I've heard that description. I think that's probably true. The only variation would be people who really knew each other. If 2 or more people get on who know each other, they might tend to cluster more in a group and continue a conversation in the same way that they would have outside the elevator. What changes the dynamic is I'm not just riding, I'm supposed to also be paying attention to when I'm supposed to get off. Because if I don't, I go to the wrong floor. So I have to not only push a button, but part of my brain has to be thinking about, okay, I'm on floor 15, I'm going down to 3, this other person is going down to 1, I have to remember to get off at the right floor.
Yeah.
So you're also partly preoccupied by, it's like being on a bus or a subway, you have to get off the right stop. So I think that also changes the dynamic a little bit, because you're paying attention to the indicator or whatever. Or in some elevators, it talks to you and lets you know where you are. So, which is also very strange. Really bad music. That's the word you're talking about. Really horribly bad music. It's not anything anyone would really want to listen to.
Yeah.
But part of that is the intent was just to make the experience a little more enjoyable. But the phrase itself, elevator music, tends to refer to this very generic. Think of a wonderful rock song that is now turned into elevator music, and you probably heard it, and you can't believe that they've done that.
Yeah.
It's awful. You hear them in malls too sometimes. Some places.
Yeah.
And I think part of that was just to enliven the experience a little bit. I would much rather listen to real music than that, or no music.
Yeah.
Just silence is fine. That's a good. I don't know. I would imagine most people don't pay any attention unless it's some strange music, something that you suddenly realize what you're listening to, and it just seems very odd. Most people probably don't pay attention. But I have never been stuck in an elevator. That's an interesting. I'm not frightened of elevators. I would not be concerned at all if the elevator stopped and I was stuck. They're very, very safe. There's almost nothing bad that can happen to you, except you might have to wait a long time for it to be repaired. But I've not had. I've had other experiences, but I've never been stuck.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I've ridden. One of the most unique experiences was I was in a very old elevator that its movement was controlled by a handle inside the elevator. and I had an opportunity to drive the elevator and to control its motion up and down. It's very hard. It's a very difficult thing to do because you're trying to stop so that it's level with the floor. I was off by about this much. I didn't even come close, and it was a fascinating sort of experience trying to do that. But I mean, most of the elevators that are really memorable are those that are observation elevators.
Yeah.
They're only outside of a building, or they're in a unique setting. The Eiffel Tower is a good example. So sometimes it's often. There's certainly some modern buildings that have beautifully designed elevators. In many instances, it's older buildings where they're the wire cages and almost like they're often talked about as a bird cage kind of design. In part of it is old, the difference between the age of buildings. But if you stay in a small hotel in Europe, you and your suitcase fit in the elevator. That's all. Because they're these tiny little things. In the United States, you, your suitcase, your friend, their suitcase, and your other friend. Everybody fits in the elevator. Not in Europe, in some hotels. And even just you and a suitcase, you're tempted to send the suitcase up by itself somehow, and then you're going to fall because they're so small. But often those are older buildings, and they put the elevator in a stairwell or some limited space.
Yeah. I've experienced like that because I know people who live in Paris, and there often, or in most buildings, they have fitted an elevator cage in the stairs. So they break off a piece of the stairs become more narrow, and you have this elevator cage inside. And in some instances, that cage is really, really small, which I couldn't stand straight. I had to stand sideways in the elevator, and I could just fit with my friend in the elevator. But maybe with a strange person, if you would be with a person you wouldn't know, maybe the experience is so weird because it's so crammed that it becomes more interesting.
I would suggest you would not ride up in an elevator with someone you did not know that was that small.
Yeah.
You would be very polite and say, no, you go first. You wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
It would just be too strange.
Yeah.
When we can, there's two things. One, current elevator technology is dependent on an elevator cable that connects the car to a counterweight. That, even with improvements in cables, puts a limit on how high an elevator can go, and we've reached that limit. When we no longer need cables, then we may see buildings that are 2 miles high. We can build them from a structural point of view. Putting elevators in them and making it efficient would be very difficult. So when we no longer need cables, and some very preliminary experiments have looked at, could they take the technology of high-speed trains, the maglev technology, where they float, and apply that to an elevator so that it would operate in the same way. So that's one. At some point, no more cables, which means we can go as high as we want to, and so we will see buildings a mile and a half, 2 miles high. And if we think about cities increasingly becoming dense, more people moving to cities and some arguments that are being made about that is it's a more efficient use of land, it's a more efficient use of resources, it doesn't take agricultural land out of production. So that's part of that. The second thing is being able to go up and over.
Yeah. Like
and there is, if you look at hold on 1 minute, I need to look at a magazine to remember the company. It's something you might be interested in.
Yeah.
ThyssenKrupp has just introduced this system which is not on the market yet, but which they're saying will go up and across and back down.
Okay. Mm.
And so, and if you looked at ThyssenKrupp's website, I'm sure you could find information on it. And that is, in some ways, it's a version of a very old idea. Have you ever heard of an elevator called a paternoster?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, it's going to continuously
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
Okay,
Very
so
good.
that's
But
kind of a
isn't
modern
that also a
version.
bit dangerous?
Well, only if you don't pay attention.
Yeah.
They no longer make them because there were more accidents on them. They can be designed to be fairly safe. I've actually never ridden one. I've seen videos of them. I know their history. That's one of the things that I want to do the next time I'm in Europe is find one and ride it and see what that experience is like.
Yeah.
But the ThyssenKrupp's new idea is a variation on that theme. And so, the two innovations are no cables. We can go as high and as fast as we want to. Although speed is an issue. Let me come back to that. And then the second one is the ability to go both horizontally and vertically through a building, which would change how we design. Now, the issue of speed is important because there are basically three factors with speed. Two are the acceleration and the deceleration of the car. If the elevator car accelerates too quickly, that's when you get that funny feeling in your stomach.
Yeah.
And it's not a good feeling. It's like on an amusement ride.
Yeah.
And the same thing can happen if it stops too quickly. With the speed, and the elevators in, I believe it's Taipei 101 are a good example. The elevator cars there are pressurized in the same way that an airline cabin is, because otherwise the passengers' ears would hurt because of the speed that the car is traveling.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that could change. We could find ourselves traveling in these little space capsules with no cables, going incredibly fast, 1.5 miles in the air, to work on the farm, because they're, I'm sure you're aware, there have been proposals for vertical farming, skyscrapers, and all of these things, which seem very strange now. I think at some point we're going to see some very interesting multi-use buildings that have everything we could imagine. Wonderful. Almost afternoon.
Okay, well,
Almost there.
have a good almost afternoon then.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good luck with your project.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Goodbye.
Bye.
Hallelujah.
So how did that go?